What long-held, scientific assertions were refuted only within the last 10 years? Before we start with the first story, please hit subscribe and ring the notification bell to stay updated with us. Story 1. The glymphatic system is a series of spaces that allow CSF to exchange with the fluid compartment surrounding neurons. It's not an organ or cellular structure, it's more like a process that allows fluid to move effectively throughout the brain and drain waste. The spaces around blood vessels in the brain become engorged during sleep, allowing fluid to more quickly perfuse the brain. It was only discovered recently because cadavers don't have active physiologic processes occurring. The glymphatic system deposits waste into the lymphatic tissues that surround the brain and spine, located in the meninges. Story 2. A long-standing conjecture in particle physics, supersymmetry, seems increasingly iffy based on the lack of evidence from the Large Hadron Collider. My understanding is that there are still some versions of it that are possible at even higher energies, but it was a big surprise that no new particles showed up so far. If you don't know about supersymmetry, you might have heard of string theory, which builds even further on supersymmetry. So string theory is also at risk of being experimentally disproven. Neither of these were ever based on experimental evidence so much as intriguing math, so technically they're not scientific assertions. But many very smart theoretical physicists basically took for granted that they would eventually be experimentally validated. Story 3. Turns out our connective tissue isn't just a bunch of thick collagen holding our organs in place. It's a bunch of interconnected sacs of fluid dubbed the interstitium. Yeah, basically, in order to see our organs on microscopic level, we would cut them open into thin slices, use chemicals to help fix the tissues together, basically preserving it, and then place these slices in between slides of glass. This process caused the fluid to drain out of these sacs and collapse. So the reason we never saw them before is that we have been accidentally destroying them every time we tried to check. Story 4. Nature versus nurture, or at the least it's more refined. Your DNA has several potential codes that may not be used in your lifetime because they have to be triggered with environmental events. Food, abuse, challenges, trauma. All of those can trigger parts of your DNA over long-term events, resulting in a change of personality such as anxiety, depression, or antisocial personality disorder. And everyone has different genomes, so the same traumas can result in different personality disorders. So it's never nature versus nurture, it's nature with nurture. Story 5. All my life the Milky Way was about 100,000 light years across. Some years ago, I think within 10 maybe, they started saying maybe it's twice that size. Big math has big errors, I guess. The problem is, where do you define the edge? The Milky Way, and all galaxies for that matter, aren't like CDs with a hard edge. They just have lower and lower density of stars and gas the further you go. Also, if dark matter is out there, is it part of the Milky Way if you can't see or interact with it? Story 6. This one was 2012, but close enough. The University of Michigan came out with a study about how sweat glands impact the healing of wounds like scrapes, burns, etc. It was believed for a long time that new skin cells were created from the edge of the wound using the undamaged ones, but they found that sweat glands help secrete the new skin cells, and that they are coming up from the wound itself. It's why your hands might get really clammy if you've just scraped them up. Story 7. That there was doubt about life elsewhere in the universe. There are 60 billion potentially habitable planets in the Milky Way alone and sextillions in the universe. There are two implications. 1, there has to be life elsewhere, and 2, it will be absolutely impossible to have any interactions with any other life form since they are many, many, many light years away. The third implication is that we may be too isolated from any other life form, but we are only one of the many possible life forms. There has to be other groups of life forms that are indeed close to each other, can and do interact, and can form an interplanetary society. I find that fascinating since we can only assume they exist without any possibility of confirming it. Story 8. I worked in a research lab around 10 years ago that focused on protein biomarkers for ADPD and other neurodegenerative diseases. Our lab was pretty big deal. We had access to samples from all the Udall centers and the VA and such. While compiling some data for a paper on ADPD and amyloid beta levels, the data didn't match the current theory, or what our lab had published previously. PI. company chair of the DEPT at this time, said, well, we know that 20% of diagnoses are incorrect. So take that top 20% of control and bottom 20% of disease groups and drop them from the dataset. See, now we see a trend. Story 9. Our mothers were told HRT, hormone replacement therapy, before and after menopause causes breast cancer. Turns out that this was a massive misinterpretation of data from a longitudinal study. In fact, estrogen and other hormones used in HRT do not increase breast cancer risk in most women, and also help to prevent a host of other diseases, including heart disease, dementia, and osteoporosis. Millions of women were raw dogging menopause for no good reason for decades. If you are a woman and you are having perimenopause symptoms, demand HRT. It can start in the early 30s for some women. Story 10. The Seco diet theory, also known as calories in, calories out, or calorie counting. While it's theoretically correct that caloric deficit induces weight loss over time, it's not the number of calories, but the quality of the calories which matter most. And poor gut health can alter the way nutrients are absorbed, which means one cannot accurately measure their own calorie intake. Additionally, the quantity and quality of hormones like leptin, ghrelin, glucagon, and insulin greatly affect your body's metabolism. In essence, delineating the process of weight loss into a simple equation ignores the biological complexity of the human mind and body. Story 11. Only a theory, but in 2022, research published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B cast doubt on the out-of-Africa theory of human origins, suggesting modern humans may have evolved in multiple regions of Africa, not just a single location. If I'm not mistaken, the paradigm goes that a precursor species to humans left Africa and went on to become several species such as the Neanderthals and Denisovans. Then modern humans eventually evolved in Africa from that shared ancestor and began migrating out. All this time, Homo species continued to develop throughout the world. In the case of Neanderthals, this evolution was somewhat similar in complexity to humans, as they developed tools and some form of culture. Modern humans, though, both interbred and outcompeted the other Homo species, theorized to be for a variety of reasons, becoming the only one left standing. I think there is some evidence that points towards fewer out-of-Africa events occurring. The biggest evidence being that the genetic diversity within Africa is far greater than the genetic diversity between populations outside of Africa. It points towards a bottleneck happening when humans left Africa. Story 12. Being trans not considered a mental illness. It was only in the DSM-V close to 10 years ago that seeking a gender transition, the replacement is gender dysphoria, which is about the incongruence between one's gender at birth and the one they identify as. The treatment is gender-affirming care, as that has been shown to lessen, if not take away, the mental issues. Trying to change the mind's view of one's gender to fit the body at birth has shown to only worsen the mental state of the individual. AKA, it's not behavioral-based. You can't use things like CBT, LOL, RBT, and conversion therapy. It's literally a core part of their personality and mental processes. If it looks like it worked, it didn't. The individual is just masking and pretending to show it worked to have the attempted behavioral changes. Stop. In short, let trans people be who they see themselves as. Edit. As this is a recurring comment, the mental issue at hand is self-identity, IDEGO, versus societal expectations, superego. There's a comment lower down better explaining, but in short, until you understand that there is gender, the social construct, and biological sex, which overlap but are not the same thing, you will have difficulty understanding why being trans isn't considered a mental illness by the APA. Story 13. Astronomer here. The detection of gravitational waves by LIGO has been revolutionary. Among other things, we have completely changed our understanding of where the heaviest elements come from. Back in the day, I learned in astronomy that all the elements after the first three were made in supernovae, including the heaviest elements like gold and silver. In 2017, however, we detected the first merging neutron star with LIGO, and telescopes spotted it, allowing us to measure the spectrum. And turns out virtually all the heaviest elements like gold and uranium are from neutron star mergers, not supernovae. Here is the periodic table by astronomical origin of the element. I remember attending a meeting in 2018 which was handing out new copies of this, and it was the neatest thing. For comparison, here is the old version before neutron stars. The first gravitational wave was first detected in 2015, which was the merger of two black holes. This was a bit of a surprise because people didn't think those were going to be the first detection. Two neutron stars was thought much more likely. But now the LIGO signal is just dominated by them. Turns out black holes of this size just exist and merge more than people thought. That's pretty darn cool. Story 14. The exact timeline is up for debate, but the long-held Bering Strait Land Bridge theory for the original peopling of the Americas has been for the most part completely accepted as incorrect by the Archaeological Society at large starting around 2015-ish. Findings predating the culture theorized to be associated with the Bering Strait land migration timeframe, termed the Clovis culture, have been continuously discovered since IRC the 52nds. But were improvement of carbon dating techniques in the 2000s to 2010s, and further work at a number of important sites in North and South America have led to a body of evidence that is pretty much undeniable. The new theory is that the original peopling of the Americas happened before the Bering Strait land bridge was accessible. These people traveled likely by small boat and hugged the Pacific coastline, working steadily all the way down to current-day Chile. The most comprehensive site supporting this is Monteverde in Chile, which features clear remains of a settlement that predates the Clovis culture by approximately 1,000 years and features remains of 34+ types of edible seaweed that were found a great distance from the site itself, supporting the idea of a migratory marine subsistence culture. The revised idea is that this first wave settled coastlines and whatever parts of the continent were habitable, not still frozen over. And after the land bridge became more available, a second and possibly third wave of migration occurred that had limited admixture with the modern-day NA peoples. Assuming they are the descendants of the first wave, that the descendants of the first wave didn't just die off. There's a lot of unknowns because of the limited number of human remains found dating back that far, and the fact that the bulk of likely site locations are now underwater. But as analysis methods continue to evolve, I'm sure there will be more discoveries made in the future. It's really interesting reading. I've been doing a deep dive into it lately just out of curiosity. Edit. Just wanted to add that I'm not saying the above new theory is fact, because it isn't. It's just what makes the most sense based on the evidence available. There's a lot of unknowns just because of limited archaeological sites, limited ancient genomes for analysis, limited diversity of remaining native populations to sample for comparison, limits to the capabilities of available technology. In 20 years, I wouldn't be surprised if this gets massively revamped to accommodate new information. As it should be. Everything's a hypothesis in archaeology. Story 15. A lot of non-specific answers here. I'm going to do some way oversimplifying, but here's a summary. Most of the glymphatic system exists as aligned channels that hug the small vessels of the brain. When looking at dead brain tissue, there is really nothing that would suggest what was going on in this space. It isn't as simple as blood, where the pressures are relatively high or easily traceable compounds, for example iron, radio-labeled metabolites, flow in relatively remarkable abundance. Glymphatics are extremely low-pressure systems, with much subtler osmotic gradients than systems we see in the periphery. And, put in the shortest and most dangerously oversimplified way possible, glymphatic channels aren't like blood vessels or even lymph channels that are these pipes with marked morphologically obvious anatomy. In other words, the glymphatic system isn't a nice, neat set of pipes. Imagine it more like all the parts of a French drain that get put in around a pre-existing pipe. Most of the anatomical pieces, i.e. paravascular spaces and AQ2 channels, that give rise to glymphatic flow have long been recognized, but it wasn't until recent methodological developments that we could see the function for which those things existed in the brain. CSF flows through two different mechanisms. Bulk flow, allowed for due to the presence of glymphatics, and diffusion. We basically had evidence some amount of bulk flow happened, due to certain modeling of tracers and metabolites, suggesting diffusion couldn't be the only clearance mechanism, but didn't have the resolution or methodology to see where it was happening while it was happening, thus entered two-photon microscopy. It was discovered in 1990, but wasn't first used meaningfully in brain tissue until 2001. It would take a few more years to dial in its use, thus that the experiments that allowed us to identify glymphatics would occur. But long story short, TPM allowed us to look at where flow was going within these paravascular spaces, and thus we could directly see exactly in what way the bulk flow, that had so long been suggested, was functioning. It wasn't exactly like finding a whole new anatomical discovery, as it was understanding that these anatomical pieces that we didn't really know the purpose of were the exact remaining pieces of this physiological puzzle we hadn't ever been able to distinctly capture in vivo. And again, don't think of the glymphatics as a strict pipe, at least in the way that you think of blood vessels as pipes. It's a bunch of foot processes and spaces that establish and facilitate gradients within these peривascular spaces. Now, we have some MRI methods for monitoring glymphatic physiology. But it was two-photon microscopy that discovered the glymphatics. Mr. Methods could only be developed once we had an understanding for what to pursue. Alright folks, that's a wrap. If you like more of this, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can also share your thoughts in the comment below. I'll see you in the next video.